I'm just so thrilled to be here now. I should let you know I am a child psychiatrist by training. So you all have to have, first of all, just a very kind thought, a confirmatory bias that you love Scottish Canadian infant child psychiatrists from Hamilton, Canada. All right, so just pause on that for a minute. I've found over the years of being a knowledge translator and an advocate for children's issues that people, when they hear I'm a child psychiatrist, enter their own mental model of what a child psychiatrist should be. So I'm not like any of that. I'm not like any of that. I want to spend the next time with you talking about my passion in understanding the importance of the brain, the development of the brain, which is different than the development of the mind, but the development of the brain and the crucial importance of relationships in that. In the development, we have lots and lots of research over the years about how children learn, for example. But it's only very recently that in Ontario, where Mary and Brenda and I are from, that we've actually started to focus on the importance of relationships in the development of the learning brain. So I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey this morning. But, you know, first of all about relationships. First of all, and Sean's not going to like this, I would like to congratulate Sean and his organization because they have just won the European Citizenship Award for their role in civic engagement with youth, which is a phenomenal. So, you know, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the science of it, but if you want to know the how-to of it, there's your man. He's, in terms of the work that Forrige does. So I always start my presentations dedicating it to the teachers, the leaders who have gone before me. It is something that's close to my heart to bring people like the late Dr. Dan Offord, who was a delightful colleague and dear friend of Mary's as well as myself. And I bring him because his study in Canada of how are children doing, what's the mental health of children, really put the epidemiology of children's mental health on the map. So Dan Offord is our Michael Rutter. And he really was the one who said, why is it that some people are sick and others are not? Why is it that some people are healthy and others are not? And so he was very interested in the social determinants of health. So what is it where you live that can determine how you're going to die and when you're going to die? He was a mentor to our dear colleague Clyde Hertzman, who died much too soon, who was involved with the World Health Organization in 2008. Sir Michael Marmot, another Sir Michael, did a report on the social determinants of health. And Clyde looked at, well, what are some of the conditions that help kids get off to the right start? So why is it that some people are healthy and others are not? And so Clyde and a group of international researchers looked at the evidence and said that what happens in childhood matters a whole lot. So, you know, in the social determinants of health, people looked at what's the life expectancy in Botswana compared to Japan for a woman. And it's something like 50 maybe in Botswana, and yet it's 80 years of age in Japan. And, you know, people might have said at one point in time that it was poor lifestyle choices. But then people started to look more deeply and see, no, it's the conditions that you live and grow in that changes your biology, that gets under the skin. So, you know, you can imagine, well, Botswana and Japan. Well, then Sir Michael Marmot and others looked to the center of the universe, Glasgow. And what he found in Glasgow is that several miles apart, the life expectancy in one neighbourhood compared to another in 2008 was 21-year difference. So in Hamilton, Ontario, where I come from, people also looked at some of the administrative data and found that that is in fact true today in the city where I live. So where I live, up on the nice mountain, and it's not really a mountain, it's more of a bump, but where I live, the life expectancy is something like 84. But where my brother teaches in inner city Hamilton, the life expectancy is 20 years less. So I'm sure if you were to plot this out, you would see that there is a very big difference in the social determinants of health in your various regions. And so what them as scientists looked at is, we have to do something about this. We may not have, some people as economists have the ability to see how we can tackle poverty. But can we do something without tackling poverty that is going to make a difference? And so what people have landed on is that what happens in childhood, early childhood, as well as what happens yet again in this massive period of growth called adolescence, can make a huge, huge difference. And it's all about the brain. So, unlike what was thought before of the brain kind of like a machine, and it was fixed, genetically things went into place at a certain time, and if you injured it, it was broken. And people with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder had a broken brain and you needed an external brain for them. The new thinking in brain development is that the brain is not fragile. In fact, the brain is plastic. It, in fact, can change. It adapts to its environment. So Clyde said, the question is whether or not these adaptations will allow you to cope with the world you are in and you are going to live in. So let me talk to you about some of the guiding principles as I'm thinking about relationships and brain development. And I bring with me to you the teachings of our Indigenous people in Canada. Now, we have many, many different Indigenous peoples, but there are some themes that run through. And I heard a Mohawk elder called Tom Porter a number of years ago. And he said things that moved me, as probably in ways that I've never been moved before. He said, in their Indigenous belief, children are the sacred ones. They are the heart of the nation. It's the sacred responsibility of the community to raise children. And when I hear of Sean and his work and the work that you do, I think that that is the guiding light, the North Star of belief. If we can actually truly think that children are the sacred ones, then we deal very differently with them. Our First Nations people also believe that children with special rights, let's change it from special needs, everybody, to special rights. Because needs is a deficit model, but special rights means that every single child is born as an identity person bearing rights. But every child with special rights has a light within and a gift that they have to give us and teach us. Imagine a world where there was that degree of empathy towards the other and towards difference. So keeping in mind the wisdom of the elders, let's think about the reality of the adolescent brain. So it's all very well, I have got a gorgeous little 9-month-old grandson, and it's wonderful to think about him as a sacred one. But I wonder when he's 13. I say no more. So what we now know, and the messages I'm going to be giving you, is actually quite different than what I just did. And that is that the adolescent brain is under construction. The adolescent brain is not an adult in waiting or a mini adult. The adolescent brain is literally being resculpted, changed not only by experience, but by the growth that's happening. So let's just start a bit by going into the brain. So let me be honest with you and say that I am a student of the neurosciences. I'm not a bench scientist who does, all that wonderful MRI and all those other kind of studies. What I do is I read tons, I deeply think and try and connect when I've got other people I can talk to, and then I translate it. So I'm a knowledge translator. So I steal stuff and bring it to you so you get to steal it back. So you can get all of these slides and use them. So why do we care about the brain? Well, it's interesting. I graduated in 1981, and I went to a medical school that believed that when you've got people from different backgrounds coming together, it enriches your experience. So I had a degree in music and philosophy, as you heard, but the science people in my first group thought that they had made a major error letting this freak in to medical school. But what we actually found was that I thought differently than some of the other people. And that when we had in our problem-based learning at McMaster University, when we had a problem, and that's how we learned, not by courses, but by problems. When we had a problem about, a 60-year-old fellow who had problems with pain in the back of his leg when he was walking, I could think differently than they could about, well, I wonder where he's walking to. And, I became a psychiatrist, so probably I was wondering also, is he happy that he's walking? I was too bloody concerned about learning the circulatory system. But you get the point, that the different brains that we brought together enriched our experience. So what we have learned in the decade of the brain and since is that our brains, who we are, our personalities are created by the experiences that we have. We heard the wonderful stories from Kira, Beth, and Aisling yesterday. And it fascinates me to think about, well, what happened in their early childhood? Your mum's there too. What happened in her early childhood that helped spark, that helped that emotional spark of I want to do something. I just can't sit here and wait. It was all of the processes and things that had happened before that lead us to who we are, positive and negative. So our brains are not just our genes. Now, I used to have a fantastic time going to the pub and arguing, is it nature or is it nurture, right? Is it genes or the environment? So we had a great time, but it was a waste of time. Because now we know that it's not the question of is it genes or is it the environment. We now know that the brain cells, as we heard from David, the brain cells literally get turned on or silenced by the experiences around them. So we didn't know this back in the day. So experience builds the brain, and that there are developmental periods of time when that ability of the brain to be changed by experience is greater. The good news is it happens throughout life. You guys have learned something here while you've been here, and if you remember something that any of us have said, your brain was changed. So the brain is capable of change throughout life, but there are periods when the brain is just so plastic and malleable for change. The early years we all know about, but the other one is what happens in adolescence. Now here's the other part. Adolescence, do you know when it starts? About 9 or 10. Do you know when it finishes? About 25. 28 later in males. Pat Dolan, how old are you? Where'd he go? He was there. So the brain is under, there you are. So the brain is under construction. We now know things that we didn't know before. But when under construction means that there is a process of growth. So let's talk just a little bit about empathy. And look, somehow or other, there's a picture of my grandson popped up. Imagine that. But I want you to look at this. So this is my little Liam with my son Andrew at 2 weeks of age. 2 weeks of age. So why? Why would we have such imitation happen so early? What's the point of that? Well, the point that strikes me so strongly about it, and you know, my son does not have an obsessive disorder of sticking out his tongue, but that we are so socially wired to connect. It starts from the very, very beginning, likely in utero because babies recognize their parent's voice. But you know, as David was describing, the bathing of the baby and all of the talking and all of the learning, babies are little scientists. The Scientist in the Crib is a wonderful book that talks about this. But we are so wired to connect. We know, and there's, I don't know about in your country, but in our country and in the US, they're talking about solitary confinement and how it kills people being in solitary confinement. When we are socially isolated, we die. So we are a social species wired to connect. And there are those who think that are part of the reason that we're seeing more anxiety in young people these days is that our basic clan is a much smaller group. Our basic social clan group. It would have been where we would have learned, as the programs that Forage is doing, we would have learned and been mentored into adulthood. And now what do? Is we warehouse children in schools with adults who are focusing on pumping in curriculum, whereas what we need is that social brain connect with others. So here's another little video clip, just a few minutes on the early years, to think about what's going on here.
Oh.
This little guy's about 18 months of age.
Oh.
So, or as this guy says, so. So what are we seeing here, as we know in this room too well? Are we seeing perspective taking? Are we seeing putting yourself in the mind of the other? Are you seeing being absorbed with the getting a high five and great job? Are we looking at that little guy looking for reward? Not at all. Where does it come from? How does he know at 18 months to do this? It's an experimental situation. He's never been in that room before. He doesn't know that man. How come he knows it? How come he knows what to do? He has, well, there's debate, but he has either observed or innately the desire to be with and support and understand the other has been beautifully held and nurtured in the everyday interactions like we heard David describe in the bath. Daily, daily, daily. The building of the social brain of connections through relationships has happened with that little fellow. Happened with that mum who described the other day, shared her story about her dad looking after her boy. All of those things happened in that relationship. So when we think about the brain, we need to be thinking about not the old view, but the old, which had, it's a fixed structure, it's a machine, you have to get, you can't replace the parts, really to this new brain science of neuroplasticity. That is the brain changing with the experiences that happen. And as David so lovely described, that when an experience comes in, it fires up, and then when there's enough of a signal, then it spreads out. It's synapses, it's connections, not new neurons, but new connections. So it's kind of like Facebook or Twitter. You know, you kind of connect and make all kinds of integrated connections. So the brain continues to grow and change all through life. So the good news is, if you're working with some grumpy old fart who says, I can't change, I've always done it this way, say, I heard this shrink. And she said, yes, you can. But as we think then about the adolescent brain, so magnificent, gorgeous growth happens in the early years. Absolutely. We have to, just a little note, it's actually a big note in the work that I do, is that brain plasticity has two sides. The baby doesn't say, this is a negative experience, I don't want it. Neuroplasticity, if it's negative environments, the brain adapts to that negative environment. So if that baby is surrounded by stress and trauma, their brain adapts to deal with that stress and trauma, so it's more vigilant, it is more on guard, it's more alert. So, as we think about that then, as the brain is an organ of adaptation and socially driven, we wonder, okay, well, how do we make sense of the adolescent brain? So as you look at this, how many people want to do this? Why is it that an adolescent brain would be interested in doing this? Does he know that it's dangerous? He absolutely does. What's different about him in terms of risk than, say, a 62-year-old woman? He says, the risk's not so great, the thrill is fabulous, right? There's a hyper-rationalization that happens in adolescence. So the brain is under construction. Now, is it new? Not at all. Not at all. As far back as Socrates, old farts were complaining about children. This is Shakespeare, but I love this comment that I would that there were no age between 10 and 3 and 20, or that youth would sleep out the rest, for there is nothing in the between but getting wenches with child, wronging the ancientry, stealing, fighting. But this is a line I love. Would any but these boiled brains of 19 and 2 and 20 hunt in this weather? Well, why do I love that statement? Because it is, in fact, because adolescents went out and were doing their frickin' hunting in the rain that new discoveries were made. All the adults would stay in and say, it's too cold. Well, except if you're in Ireland, because you'd never have done anything if you waited. Instead, you did all this morbid writing of poetry. Oh, Lord, indeed. No, not at all, not at all. Yeah. Anyway, but the adolescent brain is driven, is changed, biologically changed. But here we've got a bit of a challenge, because the adolescent brain is a biological reality, and there's an evolutionary biologist called Peter Gluckman who says that we have a bit of a mismatch, because we've got adolescence, which is biologically the time between the onset of puberty and when you can have adult roles, like having a family. And in hunter-gatherer societies, and back in the day, that was a very, very short period of time. But now we have first period in some groups around 9, 10, 11. But first baby in Western society is around 29 or 30. So we've taken this biological timeline and expanded it from a psychological and a sociological time. Not only that, but in the hunter-gatherer societies, and some of the societies still, you were mentored into and through this adult taking on of roles by others in your group, others in your clan. And now, as I said before, we don't have the same. Except now we're getting wise to the importance of service learning, the importance of looking at the innate desire to reach out and be with others for a common good, which people are now seeing is much more part of the adolescent brain than what they talk about on the television. Because what we see in the popular press is not stories as much about Aisling and Kira Beth, but about adolescents getting in trouble. When you ask people, what's the most violent stage of mankind, people think what? Adolescence. When is the most violent stage of mankind? Anybody have a toddler? 2.5-year-olds are the most violent of all people. In fact, in Canada, youth violence and crime is going down. It's going down significantly. And yet, there's still this perception that adolescents are trouble, that they don't have any intergenerational connection, and they don't have anything to contribute. So we have a job to do in building the society that shows empathy towards our adolescents so that their own wondrous stories can be shown through. But here are the changes that happen in the adolescent brain that make it challenging. So there are areas in the brain, so this is a picture of the brain with the front up here, and the prefrontal cortex, these are areas I'm going to tell you more about, and the limbic system. Now, Dan Siegel has a lovely way of talking about how the brain develops. Dan, S-I-E-G-E-L. And he says, we've got the brain in the palm of our hand, and the role of development and maturation is to have integration of the different components of the brain. So he talks about the brain as having the brain stem, which is the palm of your hand here. So that's breathing, heart rate. You know, we saw a little bit about this again with David. The brain stem is here, so heart rate, all of that. This would be the spinal column. It's more like spaghetti. The next area to develop is the limbic system, so your thumb, and that is in deep in the brain. And the last areas to develop that I'm going to talk about is the prefrontal cortex, the organizing part of the brain. So in adolescence, what we know is that the brain stem and the limbic system, as there is growth and change happening, is being bombarded by sensation, is being bombarded by emotion. And so the limbic system is being bombarded and evolving before the stop, plan, think about it, prefrontal cortex. Do you have that picture? So this is one side of the brain, this would be the other side of the brain, right? So what we see so much in adolescence is the flipping of the lid, right? Flip the lid. But I say one of the biggest problems that adolescents have is the adults around them flipping their lid, not understanding that the brain is under construction, that young people are developing new pathways and refining the pathways. What young people are busy doing is sculpting their brain. There's all kinds of pruning going on, so what activity is firing up is getting a superhighway of connection. So I came to Galway about 4 or 5 years ago, and just to get the difference, it took, we thought, being Canadian, that to drive from Dublin to Galway, the distance is about 2.5 hours. The distance is. But the number of little routes and pathways and ups and downs and ins and outs, it took us about 5 frickin' hours to get here. We'd had enough of Ireland on the first day. No, we didn't at all. But, so you've got all of these little pathways, but then once you had that superhighway come in, that's zooming, the way that things fire. That's what happens in adolescence. All of the little tributaries and small highways that were there get replaced, get pruned, and the superhighway runs through. Now that superhighway is myelinated as well. So myelin takes the brain cells and coats them in a fatty substance called myelin that makes the signals go faster. So here we've got, you're getting the picture here, we've got pruning away of the things that aren't being used, and we've got the signals going faster. But we also have all of this new stimulation coming in from the growing brain. So we see how this is a period of emotional spark. We have intense emotionality, but we also have life on fire. We've got that emotional, I can do something about this. We heard about the life learning that can come into the classroom that can activate children and young people to be excited about their learning. In Toronto, one of the schools I've recently read a book on, they took on, there were lots of Bangladeshi children living in this area in Toronto, and they realized that in the villages that their parents had come from, there were major water issues. So they became a project looking at understanding water, understanding wells, understanding all kinds of fundraising, and actually made a difference in the communities that where their roots were from. They learned so much deep learning because it related and connected to their developing brain. So here you see the blue part is the development of the brain. It goes from the back to the front and from the inside to the outside. So Dan Siegel talks about integration as being when you can bring in your emotional stimulus that comes in with your prefrontal cortex and say, this is all right, man. You can have people experience disaster and you're empathetic, both affective and cognitive empathetic response is, I'm going to get to help those people in that tsunami. So what we are so missing out on is the massive empathy of our adolescents. Why? Well, because I would say a big part of it is because what the media portrays, what the, and it was in the video that Aisling showed, what the media portrays about our adolescents is so off-kilter. It's not capturing what is going on. People think that adolescents, we did a project in Hamilton where at the Boys and Girls Club, there was a period of time from about 4:30 to 6 when the club was open for younger children. And so the adolescents weren't coming in, and they were hanging out in the Centre Mall nearby. And the vendors didn't like the adolescents hanging out there. So we decided, could we do something as a collective impact kind of thing, go in and talk to them and see what the issue was. So what was discovered, one, everybody thought the adolescents were shoplifting. We asked the police, who are the shoplifters? Guess who they were? 60-year-old women. They had these fake bottom bags that they would be stealing all the stuff. So, what's this? It's not that. And so then they looked to see, well, what can we do? There was some empty space. So they created a drop-in center for the kids. And the vendors were able to contribute to that. The police security in the mall had hated the kids. By the end of 6 months, they were going off to Raptors games. They had a mental model of what the teens were that was completely inappropriate. The teens then got together to do some organizing to help some of the seniors get in and out and around the mall. So once the door of prejudice was addressed, then in came the ability for the children to empathize. Now, it's not that there aren't challenges. The limbic system is the emotional system, and it is deeply under construction in adolescence. So the emotional system is one that says, I'm going to take risks. I just skipped over, that's not there. I'm going to take risks. The thrill is wonderful. The consequences are not so great. They are known for risk-taking, but it's normative. So that means in wise communities, they create skateboarding parks where kids can take safe risks, rather than what happens in some communities in Canada, which ban skateboarding. Well, that's just idiocy. It just makes absolutely no respectful sense. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child says that children and young people have the right to play. But if we don't have children as our sacred ones, as the heart of the nation, as our guiding principle, then we don't follow along with that. So risk-taking as part of the, where have the rest of my slides gone? Oh, isn't this interesting? Yes, oh, that image cannot be displayed, that image cannot be displayed. Oh, well, which one can? All right, that's interesting. That's interesting. So, the limbic system, it was really interesting. Too bad I couldn't display any of it. So deep in the brain, here's the limbic system, the emotional part of the brain. So you know, the way I think of it is through the early years. So if you've got a 2-year-old with a fever, right? So they feel crummy because their brain stem, they've got a fever, they are really lousy feeling, and you try and talk them into medication or taking some medicine, and you just can't do it. Right? So they're flipping their lid all the time. By the time they're 4, though, they can say, okay, you know what, Daddy? Even though it tastes yucky, it'll make me feel better. Can you see how the integration happens? In adolescence, what we know is that the limbic system, which is, has so many of the emotional processes, including reward, dopamine. So the dopamine circuitry now is understood to have a lower baseline level in adolescence. Now, has anybody ever heard an adolescent say, I'm bored? Ever heard that? Well, actually they are. And Dan Siegel, in his wonderful book, Brainstorm, talks about the dopamine levels are lowered, but the rush that you get when your dopamine reward circuits get turned on are just magnificent. Anybody remember this? You guys are still having it, Kira, Beth, and Aisling, and others. That the thrill. I remember going to a rehearsal of the Philharmonic Orchestra in my town. And I was completely mesmerized by Respighi's Pines of Rome. The emotions and the feelings that I had listening to that were just, it was amazing. I remember talking to a bunch of other psychiatrists, one of these cocktail parties, and saying, you know that experience that you get when you hear that piece of music and it just lifts you elsewhere? And they went, no. All right. But you know, in adolescence, you have those kinds of things often. Why? So Dan Siegel has a lovely explanation. We've got the dopamine circuits are lowered in terms of the baseline so that our adolescents left the cave. They went out to explore and find the other little chickies and boys out in the other communities. So we are, in fact, here because of our adolescence. Doesn't that just give you a thrill of safety? But, so, limbic under construction. So for that, we've got this emotional spark, literally filled with more emotion. But we focus too often on the negative aspect of that emotion and not nearly enough on the amazing. You want something done. We have seen live here, and Forage sees live every day. If you want something done, get a group of adolescents to do it, because they are not inhibited by saying, oh yeah, but, oh no, that won't, oh yes, but. It is an amazing time when we are not nearly capturing the gift and the beauty of what can be contributed. But why is it? Because it's not all rosy. So the prefrontal cortex, the front of the brain, develops later than the limbic system. So here we've got a really fast engine with an inexperienced driver. So when we look at the frontal lobes and how they develop, we see that the frontal lobes, when they are developed, are responsible for governing emotion, judgment, planning, organizing. Is this beginning to sound like a bug list for parents of adolescents? So they are under construction. It means that those pathways are being developed, rewired, sculpted. So when we've got a little toddler who's learning how to walk, we recognize those pathways are wiring up and they need lots of practice. So with a toddler, you don't say, okay, come to mommy. Okay, I told you once, come on, you know how to do it. We don't encourage them further, right? That doesn't make any sense. nor does it make sense in adolescence to say, as happened in my children's school, they're in grade 7, so what are they? They're 12 and 13. And the teachers say, that's it, we're not writing stuff up on the board for you to write in your organizer because high school's coming and they don't hold your hand anymore. It's exactly the wrong message, because adolescents are the ones who need the external support in doing the planning and organizing. Right? Make sense? So, my 5 children were ski racers. The truth is, I got them into ski racing so that they didn't get into hockey because it was too violent for my liking. But anyway, so they're ski racers. And I live in a town that has a little bump of a hill, so we would have to drive 2.5 hours for them to go skiing. And the ski race would last about 30 seconds. And then we drive 2.5 hours away, right? So imagine that in Ireland. So that's what we would do every weekend for many years. So this time, my one son is under construction. We arrive and he's forgotten his ski helmet. You know, so when you're going down at 90, whatever, very, very fast. I don't even know how fast. La, 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 la. I don't know. Anyways, he's coming down the hill. He obviously needs a helmet. He's forgotten the helmet. Now, I could do logical consequence and say, well, darling, you've forgotten your helmet, so I guess we won't ski today, will we? Well, there's no way I would do that. First of all, I don't have the heart to do it. Secondly, with my particular son, I would have no confidence that not letting him ski would influence at all. So, what did we do? I said, what are we going to do about this? We made a list. And so before we pulled out of the driveway, I would go with the list. And he'd say, I've got everything, Mum, I've got everything. And so after a little while, he said, you don't have to say list anymore, Mum, because I put everything in the bag as soon as I get off the ski hill. Now, it was a stinking public health hazard, but it did the trick. Right? So I was not planning and organizing for him. I was trying to wire up that planning, organizing section of his brain. Right? Makes sense? So a big difference between doing for kids and helping them do that planning, organizing. So here's the thing, though. It gets tricky. When kids are convinced of something, then they will convince themselves of that things are safe. So what we have to do is be well aware that we give them messages over and over and over again about what's safe and what's not safe. We cannot, in our country, we cannot say don't go to a party if there's booze or if there's alcohol or drugs. All of our children would be hermits. I don't know what it's like in Ireland, but I can go to any high school and get drugs. I can. So what we need to be building in our children is not this just say no. We have to help them with the resistance skills, but we also have to be able to tell them, no matter what time, day or night, give me a call, we will come and collect you. Now you may have to have a code word like canoe or dodo or something that you say on the phone that you know, I'm not asking any questions, I'm just getting there. But you know, the brain is such a social organ. Here we have a picture. Now, you guys might know who this is. So this is Michael Owen. So he played for Liverpool and Manchester, I think. Anyway, he missed some great goal. And you can see all of the people who went to the course ahead of the game that said, when your favorite player misses a goal, do this. So this just shows you how powerfully we are connected. These are mirror neurons. Now look at the yellow guys. They have their own mirror neurons as well. Sorry? Yeah, okay, terrific. Okay, so the adolescent brain then, under construction, the limbic system developing ahead of the plan, think, organize it. Now, there are some other things that happen in the adolescent brain. Sleep makes a huge, huge difference. Adolescents need, in fact, more sleep than we do. But, you know, it's like the avocado pit is too big. You know, the creator made a bit of an error here. they have a change in their sleep thirst. So they're not actually tired until about midnight. And they need 9¼ hours sleep. So I don't know what it's like in Ireland, but many of our kids are on the bus getting to school at 8 o'clock in the morning. So calculus for 8:30 is a frickin' disaster. There are some schools in Toronto that are looking to see, are there different ways that we can wire things up? So now, what we think about adolescence affects how we feel, affects how we act towards them. And I want to just finish in these last couple of minutes talking about the impact of stress on this developing brain. So we know that our fear response is very, very powerful. We have survived as a species because when we see something scary, there's a signal that goes straight to our amygdala that says, watch out, be on guard. We release adrenaline, we release cortisol, we're hyper alert, we're not worrying about digestion or reproduction, we are worrying about getting out of there. So our body is wired to be prepared as if we were coming home and run into a bear. So the adrenaline and the cortisol are our stress hormones. Cortisol is released in our morning so that we can get out of bed and then should go down. But what happens if your cortisol is up all the time? And this is one of the big concerns about adolescence. What happens if you are under stress all of the time? So the reality is that when that brain is being bombarded by stressful situations, by being bullied, by being harassed, by being not respected, by having maltreatment, what we see is that brain looks like this: irritability, poor memory, difficulty focusing. Now, to me as a child psychiatrist, this sounds a lot like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And wherever I go across the world, people are telling me there's more ADHD out there. Well, what I worry about is not that there's more ADHD out there, but in fact, there's more stress out there. That what we're seeing is not misbehavior, but what we're seeing is stress behavior. And when we think about the social brain and the development of adolescence, we are missing this wonderful, wonderful opportunity to think about how can we link in and connect in. We have barriers, but if we understand them, can we use them more creatively? So when you look at adolescents, you show them pictures like this. On average, an adolescent looks like a face like this, and they say the emotion that we see is fear, predominantly as adults. But adolescents see anger. Their amygdala, when they are seeing emotion, is more fired up. So Jürgen and Todd, when she did this research, saw that young people are reading more emotion in things than are necessarily being expressed. In comes the need for empathy education. So if our young people are in fact experiencing intense emotion, it means that we must, as adults, not be overly reactive to them. They may not be as reactive if we stay calm. When I talk to judges, I say it doesn't mean that you have to have a Botox face. You know, they're reading more emotion in your face than you think you're emitting. Doesn't mean that we need Botox, but it does mean that we need to understand under construction. But it also does mean that if we can avoid the conflict by understanding the brain development, then we can allow the wondrous opportunity for that emotional sensitivity and creative spark to live and to grow. You know, the Cree believe that children teach us many, many things, as do the elders. And this Cree elder, I heard the story out in Vancouver, talks about life is really hard. You know, we've got good in us and we've got evil in us, and they're battling all the time. It's like there's two wolves who are fighting. One is nasty and greedy, and the other is kind and generous. And one of the little ones up front says, "Grandfather, tell me, which one wins the battle?" And he said, "It depends which one you feed the most." As we think about our adolescents under construction, what we think about adolescence and thinking of this period of time as a wonderful growth period of time where there is massive empathy if it can only be unlocked and seen through the bias that as a society we have, then we can truly grow and truly see many more of our young people as the sacred ones that we've seen here. So thank you very much. I'm going to finish with that. Thank you.